Okay, now that we've gotten some of the basic visualizations out of the way, so the stuff that comes prepackaged, like gizmos and icons and all that other stuff, let's start actually diving into editor scripting. And to start off, I think it would make sense to return back to we looked at these attributes over here. So on our monster data, let me open this up. We flagged these attributes to give us things like headers or range or whatever. Maybe we want to create our own, right? We want to create our own little attribute that we can just put in code and help the designer very quickly and easily organize a script before even diving into a custom inspector window. So we're just a little block that defines how we want to arrange or display this information. So let's talk about how we can make a custom one. And specifically what we're going to do is we are going to make something like this. We're going to call it a separator. And what we want is to flag an attribute, just like we did before, with a bracket, and we'll call it separator, and we want to be able to pass it values. In this case, the 2 is the width of the separator, and 20 is the spacing. So like how much space do we want? So we could create several. We could have a separator that's 1 width and a lot of spacing. We could have a separator that's very thick but very little spacing. It gives us more options that we can use for reusability. So this is our goal. So now we need to talk about how we can do that. Typically, if you want to create an attribute like this, you're going to need 2 things. You need the attribute definition. So create this class or whatever. We need to create the definition. And then we need to create the instructions on how to draw and how to organize the data in that window right here. So first we're going to create the little class that will pass in this information and hold on to it. And then we're going to create the class that will decide how it should be drawn in the inspector. So the terms for that would be property attribute would be the definition, if you want to think about it that way. And how it is drawn to the inspector window will be the drawer. So you'll hear property drawer, for example. You'll see that come up if you look up editor scripting. We'll talk a little bit more about this later, but basically there's 2 main type of drawers to consider. There's a decorator drawer and a property drawer. Properties as if we're working with like input and fields that we can edit and information. And decorator drawers is just visual arrangement, like alignment and moving down and drawing little things that isn't pulling from these properties that we have. So don't worry about it, just a little precursor. What we need to make this happen is we need our property attribute. So this is where we're going to define our separator. And then we will need we're going to use a decorator drawer because we're just like arranging things. We're just drawing a little custom shape. We're not doing anything fancy with the data. We'll do a decorator drawer. So attribute, drawer. And when we have those 2 things, we can create this little definition that we can reuse, right? We can put this in our own code and reuse it. Okay, so let's talk about how to do that. First of all, we need to create our attribute. So we're going to do that in a new script. We're going to call this separator attribute. I'm going to make a new script here. We'll call this separator. I can never remember how to spell that. Attribute. It's important that this does not sit inside of an editor folder, so just keep that out. And when we open this up, we're not going to inherit from mono behavior. We're actually going to inherit from property attribute. Yeah, okay. And this is going to give us several things. What I'm going to do is I want to define the parameters that I would pass in, right? Like if we open our little thing here again, we may want to pass in the width of the line, and we may want to pass in the spacing, right? We're not defining how to actually draw it yet. We're just defining like what we need to declare a new one of these. Let's say we know that we need the height of our line. So we'll say read only. We'll say that's a float so that we can get very specific with it if we need. Read only is just to protect it. Like when we create it, we're not really changing that value over time, right? Like we're putting it in code, we're giving it 2, 10, whatever, and it's set. If we change it, we're creating a new one, and it's already set. So we don't need this to be like changed, and we don't necessarily want it to be changed. So that's why we're using read only. We'll call this height. We're going to do the same thing for our, what do we call it, spacing? Okay, now we're going to create something called a constructor. All that is if you type public, and instead of giving a return type here, normally we'd type void or whatever, we're going to use the class name. So separator attribute, just like that. Now, if I were to do this, we would not be taking in any parameters. And by parameters, I mean, open this back up. See how we can pass in these values when we create the class? That's what we're setting up here. So we want to be able to pass in the height and the spacing when we create the class, and then we want to be able to use that. So we're going to set that up just like parameters. We'll say float height and float spacing. Then when we pass those in, we're just going to hold on to it, just like this. So we'll do height equals height and spacing equals spacing. So when we create the class, we're passing in these two values, and then we're storing them in our variables that we can read later. One other handy thing that I might want to do is maybe they don't know the height or the spacing. They just want to do a quick divider. They don't want to worry about the exact pixels or anything like that. We could actually set a default in case they don't define anything. So if they don't put anything for the height or the spacing, then maybe we have a reasonable default. All we have to do is add an equals 1 and equals 10. So this is just setting 1 as the default height and 10 as the spacing, but if they do pass in a different value for the height, then it'll replace the 1 with whatever. It's just initializing the variable. If we don't give it any other value, it'll give it a default value. All right, so we have our attribute. This is our definition. It contains our information. We're going to use this information to actually decide how to draw it to the screen. This is one of our two things. We have our attribute, and then we need our drawer, which is the instructions on how to draw it on the screen. Now, I'm going to add one other thing that's kind of optional. I'm going to add an attribute to this. Basically, if we wanted to be able to draw multiple dividers back to back, we can declare it that we're allowed to do that. Otherwise, it may think that we only want to assign one attribute and not allow multiples. So maybe we do want to allow to draw multiples. So I can say separator, 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 and it'll add 3 lines in a row. I may want that functionality, so I'm going to add this up top. It's called system attribute usage. So we're changing how we can use this attribute. This first part is kind of boilerplate attribute targets. So we're saying that this will look at fields, and so it can put it above a field. And then the second one we need, which is what we're really going for, is allow multiple equals true. Okay, I'll put a little break there. So this will allow us to put multiple separators if we want. If you leave that off, it'll work just fine. So this is our attribute, and then we're going to go to our drawer, and specifically we're going to do a decorator drawer because we're just doing a little arranging. We're not doing anything with the information. We're just spacing out and drawing a little custom thing. Now we're going to draw the separator that we defined in our attribute that we created, and we actually need to draw it into the window. Now, this is where things are going to start to get funky with editor scripting, and it can be very tedious and cumbersome to calculate exact draw widths and heights and whatever. You have to really define exactly how you want to draw shapes in the inspector. It's not fun. You can do it. This is part of why Unity's new system, the UI toolkit or UI elements or whatever they're calling it. It's a lot more like play with visuals, and you can use an editor to define these spaces instead of doing it all through code. We're not worried about that yet. We're just looking at how we can do this the old way, and then we can better appreciate the new way once we get past that. Okay, so we're going to create our drawer. Now to do this, we actually do need a folder. This is very important. You cannot skip this step. A folder called editor that will contain scripts that are using the Unity editor namespace and libraries. So if we create a script, we're going to call this separator drawer, right? Before we had our attribute, now we have our drawer. And remember, this script has to be inside of editor. And here's why. Our separator drawer has to inherit from either property drawer or decorator drawer. Decorator drawer is a little bit simpler, which is why we're going to start off with this. But if I type in decorator drawer, we're not going to see anything, right? That's because we are pulling from the Unity editor. Anytime we have a script that is using the Unity editor and we're inheriting from anything from that, that script needs to be in an editor folder so that it does not build out with our final build. We don't really want editor scripts in our final build. We only want the runtime stuff. If we have editor scripts in there, it may spit out errors and it can be pretty bad. So I'm gonna come here, and now when I type in decorator drawer, this does work. So it's a quick reminder. In order to make this thing happen, we need our information, which we already have. That was in the attribute. And then we need to use that information to draw it in the inspector. So this is going to be our class that defines how we draw it, which is our drawer, right? Our drawer is related to actually drawing inside of the window. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to connect my separator attribute to my drawer because I want to use the information there. So at the very top, I'm going to put a little bracket here. I'm going to say custom property drawer. Then I'm going to say type of separator attribute. Okay. This creates a connection between the between this drawer and the attribute so that we have, we can access some of the information from that. Now here's the weird part. In order to continue, like at this point, we're going to start drawing things inside of the editor window. And once we start doing that, there's a few concepts that we need to understand in order to proceed. Specifically, I have a little graphic that I made here. When we draw anything inside of the inspector window or a window inside of Unity, we need to give it a position, an XY position, and we need to give it a width and a height in order to draw it. So if I wanted to draw this square, I would need the starting point, which is going to be the top left. So that's going to be my XY. So for example, up here, 0, 0, if I said 0, 0, inside of this script, if I had a script here, 0, 0 would be at the very top left. If I put 0, 20, that would be x0, right? And then 20 coming down on the y. So it's kind of weird and backwards. We're increasing our value, but we're going downwards. So it's a little bit funky. So like, let's say if we wanted to draw something on the very right side of our window, then if we gave it 50, 25, it would be x50, y25. This would be our starting point, right? So if we gave it 50, 25, then we had a width of 10 and a height of 10. We'd go width of 10, height of 10. So we draw a little block right there, okay? So this is how we need to interpret the XY coordinates on the window. And if we wanted to draw a shape, we could get a position, a width, and a height. If I put this side by side with the thing that we're trying to create, then what we need to do is we need to use the spacing to determine our Y value, right? We get our spacing over here. And then we use our height to determine the height of the line. You know, this is a very thin line, so it could be either 2 or 1 or something. It could be really thick too. We could draw a thick rectangle, that's fine. And the width we can actually get automatically by using the current height of the window because we want it to be able to, stretch from left to right or whatever. So that's what we're gonna do. We're going to decide the starting point, which is gonna be here. We're going to determine the X position, which is here, right? It's 0. The Y could be some value based on the spacing. And then our width is gonna be all the way across the window. And our height is going to be whatever is defined right here. Okay, so that's how we're going to draw. As long as you understand how to position things and what the width and height is doing, we can make several shapes, right? We could define portions of content and do things inside of that little tiny window that we draw. But it's more important that you understand how we are getting these coordinates here and the width and height when we draw our rectangle. Okay, so with that in mind, let's start looking at our script on how to do this. First thing I'm going to start off with is you can think of it kind of like the update function, like we're going to use this loop as we draw our windows. I'm going to type in public override void on GUI. I'm going to let that autocomplete. So override allows us to don't do whatever you would normally do. I want to customize how this thing is drawn. So I'm going to override and I'm going to say, do these instructions instead, because otherwise it's not going to draw anything. Okay, so here's what I want to do. I'm going to get rid of that. I don't want the default stuff. I want to customize it here. So conceptually what I need to do is I need to get a reference to the attribute, which is going to be separator attribute right here. Then I need to define the line to draw. Then I need to draw it. right? Like if I can do these three things, then I should be fine. So first thing, if we want to get the separator attribute, right here, this is pretty simple. Separator attribute, I'm just gonna rename it here. So then when we assign it, we're going to say attribute as separator attribute. Right, and we have access to this because of what we set up here. So you can just remember this will get the attribute that is defined by your custom property drawer. And we're storing it so that we can get the information. So now if we wanted to, do like separator attribute dot height, we could, or our, what else do we define? We said spacing, right? We can access it directly from there in the one that we defined, this thing over here. Okay, so let's draw a line. We already talked about this, but maybe you think about what we need, right? If we want to draw a line, we need to do something with the spacing, right? Like that's really going to be the hard part. We need to do something with the spacing. We know we're going to be all the way to the left, so x is going to be 0, and we know that we want to, our width is going to be all the way across. Our y is going to be kind of funky. We'll decide that later. And our height is going to be our height from our attribute. So first we're going to create the rectangle. So it'll be rect. Make a new simple one. We'll just define it, and then we'll draw it in a separate thing just to make this really clear for you. Call it a separator rect. Okay, and this is a struct, so we're going to say equals new rect, and then we're going to give it some values. Now remember, a rectangle needs a position, so an x position, a y position, a width, and it needs a height. So if we can give it those four things, then we can draw it. So we talked about our x position. So we're going to say position. So this rectangle that we're receiving the position of where this attribute was declared. So I'm going to comment this out. I'm going to show you. Let that compile. What I want to do is I want to start to visualize this. So I'm going to come into my monster script, and I'm going to give it just some other field. So private health. It's not health, right? It's just make it up. Doesn't matter. This is a placeholder. What I want to be able to do is I want to be able to put here separator and give it the default, right? Because we set it up so it would have default values. That's fine. So we actually do need this field below it. Okay, so I'm going to save this. I'm going to come back out. I'm going to see what happens here. You see what it's doing? Like it's giving a little bit of spacing, but we're not really drawing anything, right? Like we want to be able to see it. Okay, so now that we can see it, we can actually see what's happening as we define this rectangle. So our position is going to be right here. So our position is where this thing was declared. So we have our position, and then we need to start calculating this, and we can do some things with that. Starting from the left, starting from the top, we're going to say position dot, I think it's called xmin, which is just saying all the way to the left. What is the minimum x position it can be? And it'll be right here. Now the reason we're saying that is because, we could shift our position a little bit depending. We just want to say all the way to the left of the window. There's some other things you can do like indentation, and our position may change. We're just saying the lowest value it can be. Now we need to figure out our y position. So let's think about this. We have position dot ymin, but then we need to account for our spacing, right? Like, so we are saying start at the top, but then add the spacing. So if we add the spacing, so I think it's 10 or whatever we define, we're going to add the spacing, and then we're going to draw it there. So we'll say ymin plus, got our spacing, which is our spacing. Okay. We still need a few more things though. We need our width and our height. Our width is just going to be the current width of the window. Easiest thing to do is position.width. We're sending in the values from this window here, and we can actually get the current width of the window. So we just want to draw all the way across. If you wanted to draw it halfway across, then you could say width divided by 2. For me, I want to draw it all the way across, so it's fine, but you have some options here. And then the final parameter we need is the height. So how thick is this line that we're going to draw? And we can actually get that from the separator attribute, right? Because we defined the separator attribute dot height. So we'll say separator attribute dot height. And if we save this, we're still not going to see anything, right? Because we are calculating a rectangle, but that's just information, right? Those are instructions. We need to actually draw it. We need to call the function to draw it onto the inspector. But once we've already calculated it, then drawing it is pretty simple. Just say editor GUI, dot draw rect. So then to draw the rectangle, we give it a rectangle. So we defined it right above, right here. And we can decide a color. I mean, this could potentially be a parameter. Yeah, I mean, we'll just define a color right there. And now we can start to see. Okay. So that's pretty cool. One thing you're going to notice though is, okay, well, what if we increase the spacing? So let me go back. So, I mean, we're successfully drawing it to the screen, but now we're checking to make sure that it works, right? Like we can check our windows. All right, that's good. That's good. Now we need to make sure that we can put in different values. So I'm going to go back to my monster script. Say, okay, what if I want a line of 2 and spacing 20? Save it. Okay, and now we're coming across an issue. What's happening here is by default, we get one line to work with. But if we need to use more space than that, then we need to tell everything else in the editor to shift downward slightly. So this is the second method that we need to worry about. So the first one is on GUI. So back in my separator drawer, this is how we can draw it, right? We get access to the window here that we can draw. The second thing that we need access to is the height, because we need to tell it, hey, I need more space than that. I need you to expand for me, push everything else downwards. So in order to do that, it's another override. We'll say public override, right? So if this is one line, you wouldn't have to worry about this, but because we're using multiple lines, we need to declare that we need more space. Float, I think it's height, and it'll try to autocomplete for you right here. So by default, this returns as one line, but we need to say, hey, look, we need more than one line. It's not enough. And then we need to calculate how much height do we need. So let's think about this. Let's go back to our graphic here. The total height that we need is our spacing, and then our line height, and then more spacing, right? Because the way that I'm defining spacing, it's like you're putting the spacing here, like this is 20 pixels or whatever, I think. That's the spacing, but I want to use that and then draw the line and then add extra spacing afterwards, right? Like I want this to be evenly spaced on both sides. So that's going to be the total height that we need. It's our spacing value plus our line height plus our spacing value again. So again, we need access to our separator attribute, same as before. Right, you could just look up here. It's fine. You could copy paste code. Yeah, I mean, I could be more explicit here. Okay, so now we need to calculate the total height that we need. So we'll put that into a float, call it total spacing. We'll say separator. So we talked about it's gonna be spacing, like our vertical spacing, then the height of our line, then the vertical spacing for the total amount of space. So like separator attribute dot spacing plus separator attribute dot height plus separator attribute dot spacing. Okay, and I'll break these on the separate lines just to read it a little bit more clearly. Once we've calculated our total spacing, then we just return that value. So it needs to know how much vertical height do you need to draw with, and then we're saying, look, I don't want the default. I want to define a new amount. Then we were calculating that new amount, and then we were giving it back and say, this is how much space I need. Editor windows will readjust. And now that we have calculated it, it's dynamic. It will auto update. Save this, come back in here. Ooh, and I hope this works. Okay, oh, okay, there we go. So then we can actually change this, right? Like we can test it. We can say, okay, our spacing of 1 and of 30. Save that. Cool. And maybe we actually want the spacing really low, like 12. Okay, let's try a very low amount of spacing, 2. Kind of neat, right? Like we can do some little custom stuff that we haven't before. And this is reusable. As long as I have those two scripts, right? Our attribute and our drawer, then I can create other little custom attributes to arrange windows. We'll look at more inspector customization, but I just want to show you this one as an introduction into how to even think about drawing to the window, because this can get a lot more complex, and it will get a lot more complex. But I figure if we can draw a line, like if we can draw a simple rectangle, you can start to visualize the more complex stuff. So this is it's a good starting point. It's a cool little thing that we can reuse. Yeah, it's kind of our first little dive into proper editor scripting. So thank you for hanging around. These concepts can get kind of weird. Just stick with it. Again, Unity's new system will will simplify a lot of this, but I think it's important that we understand a possibility and how a lot of editor scripts are created currently, and then you can really understand like why the new system could solve some of these problems for you.